Okay, let's try this again. Geeks and geekettes, a little late in the week because of technical difficulties. I had to fire my engineer. That's a lie. I'm the engineer. This is a one-man show. So you're stuck with me. Anyway, Ask Chuck Dixon, number 142, redo. Take two. This is where you ask me, a seasoned comic book pro, about what I do for a living. And what I do for a living is I write comic books. And this episode is brought to you by SpinRack. Go to spinrack.io and go through a threshold into a new world. The next evolutionary step in the world of comic books. And let's get that off of there right now. Okay, first question from Fuico. What is the typical writing and deadline window per issue for a professional comic books writer? How many issues would you be working on simultaneously and expect to complete in that window? Well, I mean, if you're writing a monthly book, you need to turn I forgot. This question comes from Subscribestar, one of my loyal Subscribestar subscribers. I will put the link in the comments below if you want to go there and join the Dixonverse on Subscribestar. Anyway, to answer your question, well, if you're doing a monthly book, reason tells us you would need to write a script a month. I suggest that's not a good way to go. You need to write a script at least every 3 weeks because you want to stay ahead of your penciler. Generally, I used to stay way ahead of my pencilers, 3 month minimum. At some points, I was 6 months ahead of my art team, and on a number of occasions a year ahead, particularly on Nightwing. And writing that far ahead allowed me room in my schedule if other things came up. Miniseries, I could pitch to other companies. I could do special projects because nobody was waiting on me. I was ahead of my deadlines, and I had free time. So I bought myself that time by working ahead. The entire time I was at DC, I wrote all of my own inventory issues, which kind of defeats the purpose of an inventory issue because an inventory issue is supposed to be written by a fill-in writer in case the regular writer fails. But I did my own fill-ins. And on Nightwing, Scott McDaniel drew our own fill-ins. It's a pretty amazing record. But anyway, yeah, you want to stay ahead. Now, as far as working on different issues simultaneously, I never do that. I never did it. I never do it now. I tend to stay on a comic script beginning to end. I stay on it till it's done. I never leave a script in the middle to go work on something else. And often I'll write, especially back when I was working on monthlies at DC and Marvel, I might just sort of chain write. I would get on a series like Detective or Robin and just write a number of issues in a row. In fact, often completing a complete arc before moving on to a different comic. So if you're ever gonna be a professional writer, I suggest that you respect the deadline, respect the calendar, and try to beat it. Of course you're going to write at your own pace, but you can only do that if you exceed the schedule, is what I'm saying. Because you might. I don't believe in writer's block, but every once in a while you get stuck, or it's just not flowing right. And if you're way ahead of schedule on your work, if your deadlines are way in the future, you have time. You can walk away. You can, go for literally walk away. You can go for a walk, spend time with the family, go to the movies, whatever, and get your mind. Because if you're having a problem with a story, the best thing to do is just walk away from it and trust that you will solve those problems. Because if you're a professional writer, if you have the chops, you'll always solve the problems. You're never going to meet a story problem that you can't overcome. You have to have faith in yourself. You can talk yourself into writer's block. You can, and writers have done that. And writer's block is a horrible and cruel thing, but it's often self-inflicted. and alcohol is not an answer. If the history of writers have told us anything, from Ernest Hemingway to F. Scott Fitzgerald, yeah, just take a walk, and not to the local tap room. Do people even say tap room anymore? Okay, Chris, I'm not even going to try your last name. It took me a year to figure out how to pronounce Gary Quappis's last name. So, okay, you talked about Denny O'Neil, and you're welcome to correct me here in the comments below. You talked about Denny O'Neil and others' retirement and how the comic industry changed when that happened. Do you have an opinion about the impact of Marvel following Mark Gruenwald's untimely death? Did you ever work with him? Even as a young lad, I remember Gruenwald having a very strong grasp of what made Marvel tick, and he would have been a natural fit for editor-in-chief, at least from a creative standpoint. Losing him was devastating for Marvel, in my opinion. You're absolutely right. Mark was essential to Marvel in the period in which he was an editor and writer, and he was dedicated to the company, understood how to work with freelancers, understood deadlines, understood the importance of branding and things like that, and he was much beloved by everyone that he worked with. And boy, it just, he left us way too soon. He was a young man, still a young man when he passed, and left an indelible hole at Marvel. I mean, it's undeniable, as well as the comics medium as a whole. I mean, I know so many of my peers and contemporaries thought very, very highly of Mark, and his passing was a shock to us all, and I think wounded Marvel, because he would have been editor-in-chief instead of Bob Harris, and we all know how that turned out. Bob Harris basically managed Marvel Comics' decline through the late 90s, and except for a brief spurt in the early 2000s, they've continued to decline. Mark was young enough; he probably would still be a force at Marvel, were he still with us. So, yeah, very, very sad passing. Did I ever work with him? No, I wasn't in that interior clique at Marvel. I didn't. I wasn't an insider. I wasn't part of the Marvel mainstream. I basically worked on ancillary characters like the Punisher and Conan and stuff like that. But I never got to work with the core, Avengers, Fantastic Four, that stuff, because that was pretty much a closed shop. You got to remember, a lot of these comic editors at Marvel, both at Marvel and DC, they all knew each other from the neighborhood. You know what I mean? So outsiders really weren't that welcome, and it was a hard group to break into. Now, the only time I ever heard from Mark Gruenwald, which is funny because he was considered, be one of the nicest guys in comics, and as I said, much beloved. The only time I ever heard from him was when he called to yell at me. I had written a Moon Knight story that was part of Acts of Vengeance, which he was overseeing, and in the story, the whole idea of Acts of Vengeance was you were supposed to have your hero go up against villains they had never encountered before. And I pitted Moon Knight against Killer Shrike, some female villainess, I can't remember, and the Trapster. And in my story, Killer Shrike wants to be the alpha male. He wants to be the big dog. He's trying to dominate the other two. And part of this is insulting the Trapster by constantly referring to his former villain name of Paste Pot Pete. Keeps calling him Pete, keeps asking him where his paste pot is, and things like that. Just generally ball busting to dominate this character. And Mark called, and he was very passionate about. He said that I was mocking a beloved Jack Kirby creation. And I was like, I'm not mocking him. Killer Shrike is mocking him. I'm not. Killer Shrike isn't speaking for me. I don't have a long time history of animus against the Trapster, and want to malign him in a story using Killer Shrike as a proxy. But I don't think Mark bought that, and and I wasn't. I just thought it was a funny character bit. These are bad guys. They're hoods. They're criminals, and wouldn't they? They wouldn't necessarily all get along like chums. It's just trying to add a little characterization, a little tension, a little humor. But he was having none of it. But that just shows you what a tight ship the guy ran, and he definitely had a vision for Marvel, and it's missed. Marvel really, really needed him, or someone like him, but there was no one like him. So sadly, we've all suffered as comic creators and comic fans. We suffer the loss to this day, I believe. J. Haley Tang. As a huge fan of your Airboy series and a fan of the character in general, I'm often told that I should really read James Robinson and Greg Hinkle's Airboy series. But every time I look into it, I'm immediately turned off. I tend to find that kind of self-referential meta storytelling incredibly cringy and self-indulgent. But what do you think of it? I consider you the authority on this character, having contributed more to the mythos than probably anyone. So if you say it's worth reading, I'll suck up my bias and finally check it out. I guess I've written more Airboy than anybody ever. So I obviously have an affinity for the character. I had an affinity for the character even before I began writing it. I was a big Airboy fan when most comic readers had no idea who Airboy was. He was a very popular character in his day, but fell into obscurity when and eventually public domain when Hillman Publishing decided they didn't want to deal with the comics code and just stopped publishing comics and went back to publishing crossword puzzle books. I was a bit disappointed. I mean, I heard that James Robinson was going to do Airboy, and I was really looking forward to it. I was really anticipating reading it because I like Robinson's writing in general. He's a very, very good comic writer, and if you've listen to a lot of my videos, that's not a sentence I say very often. Somebody is a very good comic writer. And I like how he handles Golden Age characters. And I really thought, hey, this is going to be cool. But I guess he just decided, ultimately, this was never an Airboy comic. This was a comic about sort of dysfunctional creators, and I think he just chose Airboy as a real life Golden Age character that he could use because they were in public domain. And Airboy, at the time and probably still today, is the best known public domain Golden Age figure out there because there's been so much Airboy material thanks to me. But I think that's what he was going for. I think that you could have put the Black Terror, or the Phantom Lady, or any other public domain superhero character could have been the title character in this book, and he still would have written the same story about a comic book writer and their difficulties in finding new material for a character that well-established character had been around a while. It's very much like the movie adaptation, Charlie Kaufman's movie, which I think is semi-biographical, about a writer trying to adapt The Orchid Thief into a screenplay, a nonfiction book about flower hunters in the Everglades that is pretty much unfilmable. To this day, nobody has made a movie of that best-selling book. And in this movie, the Nick Cage character has a nervous breakdown and possibly is hallucinating through much of the film. As no one but Nick Cage can do better, than that kind of character. Is kind of on the edge, fragile, frail character, slowly losing his sanity. And I think that's the vibe that James Robinson was going for. And I didn't check the dates on these things. I don't know which one predates the other. I don't know if adaptation inspired James Robinson or they happened simultaneously or whatever. But, that was the vibe he was going for. And I've read some of it and it's good, but it's not Airboy, which is disappointing because I really was looking forward to seeing what he would do with Airboy and the Airboy cast. Jared Harahook. Help me out with that one too. What's the derivation of that name? I'm very, very curious. Batman is considered a Mary Sue in modern times. I addressed this to a Batman fan group and asked, what are Batman's flaws? I know he has them. And the question was sycophantically rejected. With you having written him for 10 years, I was wondering, what would you say are his flaws? He absolutely has flaws. He's not a Mary Sue character. Mary Sue character, a Mary Sue character is a character that's perfect, always has all the answers. There's never any real challenges for them because they just sort of, know it all. They're the best at everything, and they're just wonderful, perfect people, and therefore ultimately totally uninteresting, totally unengaging. Batman is anything but that. I mean, Batman is not perfect. He's often challenged. I can't think of many other superhero characters who have been, suffered like Batman, not only from his origin onward, but, as Batman. I mean, he's been trounced, beaten, crippled. Batman, routinely suffers, broken limbs and injuries. I mean, this is going all the way back. I mean, I remember some of the, my favorite Batman story. He's basically gunned down and hospitalized, in the Batcave, of course, but in a little hospital that Alfred set up because Alfred can do anything. Maybe Alfred's the Mary Sue character. But Batman is not a perfect character. And does he have flaws? Yes, he has flaws. He can be a bit of a prick. He expects everybody to rise to his level or his ideal of perfection. He expects everyone to be as dedicated and tireless as he is. And, that can be a bit of a pain in a person. He also has serious trust issues, as Scott Beatty pointed out to me recently, which he does. I mean, this is a character who, ostensibly in comics, Superman is considered to be Batman's best friend, but Batman doesn't trust Superman. One of my favorite scenes in all of comics is Kelly Puckett's story in which Dick Grayson meets Superman for the first time and is just, has a total man crush on Superman and is talking to Batman about it. And Batman says, remember, he's not human. I mean, that's a great scene. And it's so Batman because he doesn't cozy up to people real easy. And, Batman is got to be a hard guy to get to know. He doesn't really have a life. Bruce Wayne is a facade. Bruce Wayne is a facade in the way that Clark Kent is not. Clark Kent is Superman letting his hair down and just being a human. Just being a goofball like the rest of us, where nothing is really expected of him. It's not expected to save school buses full of children as Clark Kent, so he can just be a guy, hang out. But Bruce Wayne is very much a mask, a portrayal, a part that Batman plays, and it makes you wonder who is the real Batman, because even Batman, I mean, Batman's not a real thing; it's a construct he created. So are both of Batman's identities personas, and there's no real person inside? I mean, who is he when he's all by himself? What does he dream of? I mean, we'll never know, which again is not a Mary Sue character. He's nuanced, he's mysterious. There's a reason why this character has been around almost 100 years and popular that entire time. Without a doubt, the most famous, well-known comic book character in the world. And no Mary Sue, because if he wasn't Mary Sue, he would have been forgotten about long ago. So there. Go back to your group and lay that on them. Dwayne Thomas, do you prefer ebooks, or are you one of those people who believes it's not a real book unless it has paper pages, for whom the physical, tactile sensation of turning the pages is a huge part of the pleasure of the reading experience? Personally, I went almost completely digital years ago, and these days rarely read a paper book or comic book. Yeah, I'm a physical media guy. I read some books on digital, particularly like if I'm at the doctor's office or whatever, because, man, you bring a book into a waiting room or a newspaper, take a newspaper someplace and read it, and people stare at you like, you showed up on horseback. You're sitting there reading a book and people are like, oh, who's this weirdo? Especially if I read a lot of vintage paperbacks simply because the material isn't available anywhere else except in the original paperbacks from like the 60s or 70s. And I'll take one of them and I'm reading it, and man, you just get the weirdest looks. Maybe it is weird, but I prefer seeing books. And I read recently the Japanese actually have a word for having a home library, and my home basically is a library. Every room has bookshelves in it. And the Japanese have a word for it, which I wish I could remember the word, but it basically means like you're a mental library. Like it's a library you keep in your mind of all the stuff you've ever read. And having the stuff on bookshelves where you can see the titles, it reminds you. And if you have books on a shelf in your house, you know this. You walk by them, and it's almost subliminal. You just sort of glance at the bookshelf. A few titles pop out at you, and when those titles pop out at you, if you're anything like me, you sort of see this little mini trailer in your head of the book. It just reminds you of the plot, a favorite scene, a character, or whatever, and you just see just like this flash of memory of reading that book, and it kind of reminds you of what you've read, which you're never going to get in a digital library unless you're sitting there scrolling through your digital library, and who does that? So I mean that's, to me, is a good thing, and I think the tactile thing is a real thing. I know there's a lot of talk about how some people can't learn without a tactile element to what they're reading. For me, I like to hold the book and I can turn it to the side and see how many pages are left. How close to the end of the story am I getting? How far into it have I read? It's I don't know. It just gives you a sense of a more of a temporal experience. But more on the tactile thing. We decided to homeschool our children, by which I mean my wife homeschooled them. 2 flashcards, and I turned into a bad dad. I just lost my patience. But my wife stuck with it, and she read, I don't know how many books on educating children. And the one thing she came up with on her own was our youngest. I never thought she'd teach him to read. And she did. And what she came up with was using little plastic letters. And because he could touch them, and this is so much his personality, even today, if he could touch them, they made more sense to him. They were like real to him. Just like reading a book to me is like I'm really reading. He learned to read very quickly after she used this tactile approach. And here's the thing that amazed me was not only did she teach him to read, which I just never thought would happen because he was almost resistant to learning to read. But often when someone who is resistant to reading or has a difficult time learning to read learns to read, they really don't like to read. They've learned how to do it as a function, but they don't like it. But our youngest son reads voraciously now, which I've never seen that. I've never seen that before. A reluctant reader turn into an enthusiastic reader. So that's a big deal. And I also think the tactile thing comes into play with a lot of readers in that if I imagine there's a lot of people like me, is that I don't retain what I've read digitally as well as I do on paper. And I guess that has to do with the sense of touch. I don't know. I don't know what that has to do with, but I don't tend to retain what I've read. It's like when they use computer games to teach kids things. They're not, the information doesn't stay in the kid's head long because it's really about the game to them. It's not about the learning. And so they'll learn things to meet the goal to go to the next level. And as soon as they get to the next level, forget everything they learned to get there. So, digital learning is just a bad idea. Wow, a deeper dive into that than I thought. But yeah, I prefer paper. Okay, it's time for Dwayne Thomas Lethal Questions. He's got a bunch of questions. Dwayne's been piling them up. He's been banking questions for me. And let's get to a few. Auto pistol or revolver? Well, I'm a big fan of the 1911 .45 automatic, the workhorse, the standard sidearm of the United States Army for well over 100 years. And I know some people don't like them. You either love them or hate them. Yeah, they can be wildly inaccurate, except in the hands of someone who knows what they're doing. And I have seen people at the pistol range, my wife being one of them, who can work magic with a 1911. It made me think hard about the fact that why would you teach your wife to use a handgun that well? But yeah, she could be dangerous with one of these. And Sig Sauer, nobody makes a better automatic in the world, in my opinion, than Sig Sauer. If I had my wish, every cop in America would be armed with one of these. But they're a little on the pricey side. But it's for me, it's the Rolls Royce of semi-automatic pistols. But as good as those guns are, and as much as I like them, I'm a wheel gun man, and I probably have more. Well, I shouldn't say that. Anyway, and my favorite is a Dan Wesson 44 Magnum. I got big hands, and a gun like this with the Pacmar grips just feels right. The balance, everything about it feels right. Unless something has gone disastrously wrong, a revolver doesn't jam. If something caused the revolver to jam, you'd probably too late. You probably already lost your hand. I'm way better with a revolver than I am with any automatic. I'm actually pretty good with this thing at the range. And one time I even amazed myself at a range I was shooting with state troopers up in Maine, and had the best shooting day of my life. I think I prayed a lot beforehand, because you don't want to be a lousy shot in front of a bunch of state troopers. So I think I earned my man card at the range that day. Maybe I'll tell that story another time. Another question from Dwayne: Ginger or Marianne? Come on. It's Marianne without question. Absolutely. The Beatles or the Rolling Stones? As I get older, it's more and more the Stones. They are a true rock and roll band, truly unique. Yeah, the Beatles are great. Who doesn't think the Beatles are great? But the Stones speak to me more. I find them more interesting. I find more nuance in this group. And they're just rough and ready, fuzzy, grungy rock and roll from beginning to end. They never honed it to a fine art. They just stayed basically the same band they were from the very beginning. And you gotta honor that kind of integrity. Another one from Dwayne. I know your love of Steve Ditko's work, but I have to ask, Ditko or Kirby as the most important comic book creator artist ever? I would argue for Kirby. Spider-Man may be the single most popular Marvel character, but I would find it awfully hard to argue that Kirby wasn't the best single idea man that comic books have ever seen. He's just the greatest idea guy ever anywhere. I think any field this guy had decided to go into, any creative endeavor, he would have been, the guy, the go-to guy. Kirby, you got to wonder. I mean, Kirby was a guy that grew up poor, and he didn't have a lot of education. Yet, if you ever talk to him, I got to talk to him once extensively, and his curiosity, his intellectual curiosity, is just amazing. I mean, this guy was interested in so many things and could talk about them. He was conversant with so many things about science and technology and pop culture. He stayed up to date, and it wasn't like an effort to be hip. He was just honestly curious about what was going on in the world around him, and he's just a big thinker. He was a big thinker, and you got to wonder what if this guy had like a university education? Would we be now driving or possibly flying around at Jack Kirby Creations? And a big thinker. I'm gonna point to two things to prove what a big thinker he was, even outside of comics. He foresaw two things that are happening now, that are with us today, and that no one else foresaw. He was the first guy to think this was going to happen, and one of them is virtual reality, which he foresaw in an issue of the 2001 comic that Marvel did for a while. And he had a whole story about virtual reality and what it would be like and its effect on the world and everything else. But more importantly, he was the first person to foresee a device that all of us, well, nearly all of us have everywhere in the world. And that's the smartphone. In his Fourth World books, all of the characters from New Genesis and Apocalypse had one thing in common. They all carried something called a mother box. And it was a smartphone. You could talk to it and it would talk back. It had all the information you needed. If you were lost, it would help you find your way. If you had a question, it would answer it. And it was a smartphone. And the thing is, at the time, in the early 70s, when Kirby introduced this, the technology seemed so outlandish, so impossible. I mean, yeah, this is a wonderful conceit for your epic sci-fi adventure, but that could never happen. You could never have that level of computerization in something that small. I mean, so I think that's why a lot of people forget about the mother box, because they just don't connect it to our world today. But Kirby foresaw it. And I think when Kirby had these prophecies, they weren't just idle thoughts. I think he believed that these things could happen, that we were capable of, mankind was capable of creating this level of technology wonders. So, in his mind, I think that we were all just catching up with him and the things he thought about. So, yeah, I mean, I'm a Ditko guy all the way. I do comics because of Ditko. Spider-Man was an enormous influence on me, still remains an enormous influence on me. But, like Albert Einstein, Steve Ditko had a few good ideas. Kirby had endless good ideas. Just fantastic. And was the true driving force behind Marvel. I mean, without Jack Kirby, you wouldn't have this, entertainment juggernaut worth literally billions and billions of dollars. He was the nuclear reactor. He was the creative engine. He was the force behind all of it. And you can't deny it. David Jordan, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the legacy of the Batmobile in comics. In my opinion, the Batmobile is the one part of the Batman legacy that movies and TV have always beat the comics when it comes to coolness, from the 66 show all the way to the latest Batman movie. At the same time, as I love the cool, distinctive Batmobiles over the years, I think it would make much more sense for Batman to have a car that could blend in as far as exterior looks with other cars, like how you had Nightwing's car do in your run on that character. Yeah, the Batmobile's awesome. I mean, Batman's such a great character, and he has such great things. The Batcave, the Batarang, the utility belt, all cool stuff. And of course, the Batmobile. It's possibly the most famous fictional vehicle in the world. I mean, right next to James Bond's Aston Martin. And it doesn't matter what permutation it's presented in. It's always awesome. It's always like the coolest car ever in the whole world. And, when I was a kid, I used to draw pictures of the Batmobile. I was fascinated with Dick Sprang's version of it, which would appear in like the Batman 80-page giants that I loved as a kid, and I would just spend hours drawing my own versions of the Batmobile. So yeah, it's like the coolest vehicle ever, and yeah, we don't really think about it that much in the comics, as much as we should, because it's such an integral part of Batman. It deserves more thought. Now, I'm a logistics guy, so when I got to work on Batman, one of the things that attracted me most was making sense of all the Bat technology. What was the Bat computer, right? And I determined that it was, that Batman had his own offline Cray supercomputer underneath the floor of the Batcave in a special cooling chamber. I mean, things like that. And of course, in this effort, Graham Nolan was an enormous help because he liked that stuff too. He likes thinking about the logistics of these characters. How does this work? How does that work? And it adds it has resonance, I think, to the world if you make it seem more believable. So I put some thought into the Batmobile. What is the Batmobile like? And I came up with a whole bunch of. I came up with like a profile, a biography of what the specs for the Batmobile. And in my version, it had two McLaren engines mounted sideways. In case one engine failed, the other one would kick in. And it had all kinds of changes to its transmission, brakes. I can't remember all of it. But there was a whole lot of redundancy built in to the Batmobile, as well as its own security devices, because Batman's not always in the Batmobile. He's got to park it at some point to go up on the rooftops and battle crime. And so, couldn't the Batmobile be towed away, vandalized, stolen? So I did an entire story showing how the Batmobile would protect itself to a near lethal level if anyone were to try to steal it. A bunch of car thieves attempt to steal the Batmobile and pay dearly in the House of Pain for trying to do so. So, these are the things that I would think about. And one of them led to that scene in Batman Begins where Bruce Wayne is at, Wayne Corp or Wayne Tech or whatever. And he sees the Tumbler and decides this would be a good vehicle for him to drive around in as Batman. And he says the line, "Does it come in black?" So basically, Bruce Wayne picks the Batmobile off the lot. Now, this is something that had never happened in the comics until I did it. Prior to my sort of reboot of the Batmobile's origin, soft reboot of the origin, it was understood that Bruce Wayne and Alfred built the Batmobile in the Batcave. Okay, I'll buy that Batman's the world's greatest detective. He's a badass. He's a great crime fighter, master martial artist. But I couldn't buy that he and Alfred were automotive engineers. Yeah, they probably could have built a car, but the most awesome car in comics? No, that's a step too far to think that they had the time, the talent, or the skill to put something like that together. And so I wrote that basically the same scene that shows up in Batman Begins, where early on Bruce Wayne is at one of the Wayne Company facilities and sees this experimental military vehicle that they're working on, and basically says, "Hey, I want one of them for myself." The Does It Come in Black scene. And when I saw the movie, when I saw Batman Begins at the theater, I came home and called Paul Levitz, who was then the big man at DC, and I told him about it. I said, "Look, I'm the first guy to do this." And he said, "Let me look into it." And about 15 minutes later, he called and says, "Yeah, you're right." And they stroked me a check, which was nice. That was cool. So I was acknowledged. It was acknowledged officially that my origin of the Batmobile is canon now. Jacob Wilson, I have the following question which I'd like to submit concerning Winterworld. Do you have creator ownership of this property? And if so, do you have any future plans for it? I heard a rumor several years back about a possible film. Was there anything to that? When I took these questions to Google, I came upon this novel of the same title by an author named A.G. Riddle, which appears to have a similar premise. Were you aware of it, and do you find the similarities problematic? Yeah, I own the rights to Winterworld along with Jorge Zafino's estate. So we co-own this property, copyright, trademark, and the rest of it. But the thing is, when it comes to titles, I mean, you could write a novel called Moby Dick. You could write a novel called Gone with the Wind, and there's nobody can really stop you from doing that. But you can't make your Moby Dick novel about a guy hunting for a great white whale because that's too close to the original. So I believe in Winterworld is one word, even though it's broken up here on these covers. Winterworld is one word in my version. This other novel, he breaks it into two words, and I think the other novel is the first in the series. I think the other novels in the series have different titles, but yeah, it is the same premise. It's a frozen over. The Earth is frozen over in his particular apocalypse. I've never read the novel. I frankly haven't paid much attention to it. My only concern is if they went to try to turn it into a movie or television series, that's when I would want to get involved and see how many points of similarity there were between his novel and my stuff. Because that's what these suits are based on, is areas. I forget. It's like a definite number of similarities. It's a threshold you have to pass. I forget if it's like 16 points of similarity or 23 points of similarity, whatever. And if you can show with just cause that this work was lifted from another work, did this guy steal from me? Because in every time one of these cases comes up and it goes to court, the defendant is always saying, well, I never read that book. I wasn't aware of it at all. Well, if you can find enough points of similarities, you kind of prove, you did see that other work. So anyway, that's for another day. Hopefully that never happens. But yeah, I could definitely challenge any right to Winterworld and the things I came up with. I can defend my corner on that. As far as, we were real close back when IDW was getting heavily into media before their current financial troubles. They had struck a deal with Microsoft. Microsoft was going to start its own streaming service and lay out, a couple of $1 billion to create content. And Winterworld was one of the properties. I mean, it looked like a sure thing. Like, these things always look like a sure thing. But when you deal with Hollywood, you have to turn your heart to stone. So I wasn't real excited because I'd been there before. But it did look close. It did look like this was going to happen. And then for whatever reason, Microsoft decided that this was a bad idea, and they cut the slate of productions down to 2 things, and I don't think even those 2 things were produced. So Winterworld was cast adrift. IDW assured me that other people were interested in the property. I even spoke to a screenwriter at some point. I don't think anything got written. For a while, National Geographic was very interested because National Geographic was considering scripted entertainment as part of its cable channel. They're doing that now. National Geographic has scripted shows. It's kind of weird because you would think National Geographic is nonfiction all the time, but whatever. So yeah, it got close, but nothing happened. So, but I've been there so many times. Now, speaking of Winter World novels, there is a Winter World novel. It's available on Amazon, written by me. And it's a prequel. It tells the basically the childhood of Scully and how he came to be the person that he came to be, the cynical world traveler in a world that's a frozen hell. And it is available, and it's grim. It's a grim book. So not the feel-good book of the year, but it is out there. So there is another Winter World novel. Tony Grigo, what are your thoughts on Ablaze Comics' The Cimmerian? Ablaze publishes, they republish in English these French comic albums that are based on the original Robert E. Howard Conan stories. In Europe, where Conan has been in public domain for years, these graphic albums are called, Conan, but here in the United States, the people at Ablaze have wisely hedged their bets, and they call this series the Cimmerian, so they don't get any lawsuits from Funko or Funpack or Funorama or whatever the name of the company is that owns Conan now. Conan no longer belongs to the Howard estate, such as the Howard estate ever was. These are cool because they're all done by different creators. Each one takes a classic Robert E. Howard Conan story and does it up. A full color graphic novel treatment. And each one is by a different writer and a different, that's not supposed to be there, a different writer and a different artist. And the effect is fantastic. I mean, each one of these is a fresh take. And I can imagine there's a competition, a friendly rivalry. Everybody wants to be the one that everybody loved. You want to do the best one. You want to beat the guy that, did the one before you. Nobody wants to basically crap one of these out because you're going to look like, you're just going to look like you didn't make the effort everybody else did. So competition is a good thing. And so each one of these is just an amazing looking level of detail, level of action, and they are very authentic, slavishly loyal to the original Conan stories. But, Howard wrote in such a way that he leaves a lot open to interpretation, and these writers and artists take full advantage of that. And as you can see, the styles vary wildly, which makes it a really, really exciting series. Now, what do I feel about Ablaze's editions? Well, I'm glad they're here. I'm glad they're in the United States. But I prefer the French graphic albums, which, I've bought all of them because they're done in the European album format, which not only is larger, but is wider. European comic albums tend to be at a different aperture than American comic books. But Ablaze, probably pressure from distributors and retailers, they've scaled these books back to comic book size, probably so that they'll fit in the pockets at the comic book shops. I personally think this is an enormous mistake. If I were advising Ablaze, I would say, look, don't listen to anybody. Just faithfully recreate the French album format because, boy, there's a huge difference. Because the American comics are a narrower aperture. I'm going to get really geeky here. American comics are narrower than, and you can see it here, the ratio than European comic albums. And so when you take a European comic album and try to fit it into an American comic book format, you end up with a lot of dead space at the top and bottom of every page, and consequently you can't do full bleeds. There's a lot of full bleed stuff in the French albums, and they're just far, far, far more impressive than what Ablaze has done. Nothing against Ablaze. I'm glad they did this. I just wish they had gone with what was probably their first instinct and done these as faithful recreations of the European albums. Because while the Sumerian books look great, the French albums are really wow. I mean, there's a lot of value there. You feel like you got something special going on because the art's larger, it's presented in the way it should, and because of the aperture in the American comics, they have to shrink the art down even more than normal to fit on this page. So, kind of the difference between full screen and letterbox. You know what I mean? Speaking of Conan, my first Conan novel still out there for sale. You can get it at Amazon, you can get it at Barnes & Noble, or you can order it direct from Archaven. I will have the link down below in comments. If you order it from Archaven, you get a free ebook version. It's the only way, speaking of digital versus physical media, it's the only way to get an ebook version of this book is to buy it from Archaven. And yes, I have completed a second book, and I am over halfway through a third Conan novel, and I might just keep going because I'm really having a good time writing these. If you have a question, suggestion, picture your kitty cat, your puppy dog, whatever, you send it to brunobookstore@gmail.com, brunobookstore@gmail.com, and that's the most direct way to reach me. You can ask questions here in the comment section. You can ask me on Facebook, Twitter, or go to Subscribestar and ask me questions. But the most reliable way to reach me is brunobookstore@gmail.com because I check it a whole bunch of times every day. So, hey, thanks for watching or rewatching. Sorry about the glitch in this week's episode, but I hope this fixes it. And actually, I honestly think this episode redo is better than the original because I think I went into a little more depth, a little more clarity. I just feel better about my answers in this version rather than the version that has been erased forever. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Thanks for subscribing and liking and all the rest of it. And thank you mostly for your questions. I have a lot of fun doing these. You people make it fun. You make it interesting. You make this show what it is. So please keep sending the questions in, and I'll see you down the road.